Solo Leveling was one of the most hype anime of the last season, and with good reason. It was an unabashed power fantasy with great animation whose story didn't immediately devolve into inane nonsense. Some have described it as all hype, but you know what? Writing hype is not as easy as you may think. But let's dig into what I said about it being a power fantasy. Power fantasies are great. I mean, we can act like they aren't, but there's a reason they are so popular, and yet associated with so much disdain. And while their reputation is understandable, their continued success as a concept is hardly surprising. A power fantasy, in broad terms, is a story that appeals to its audience by giving them a situation where they get to be excessively powerful and indulge in the desire to succeed vicariously through the character. It can be a story about becoming the strongest ever, a story about being the romantic focus of several attractive partners, a story about being loved and adored by all who meet you, a story about being underestimated but having hidden talents no one appreciates. Anything can be at least partially a power fantasy if it involves something someone wants to experience. My last video was partially about how the classic Disney princess movies are underappreciated power fantasies, but there tends to be a lot of negative press regarding the concept. And that's because some of the most basic tenets of the power fantasy tend to be antithetical to traditional storytelling. For the simplest, most basic example, being the strongest ever kind of defeats the concept of challenge and risk. And if your protagonist gets too strong too fast, it gets harder to make the audience believe you're actually going to challenge them. For a more complicated example, there is the problem of the underestimated character. This is a character who has a trait that people think is bad but it's actually great. Or they have hidden strengths which can lead to the question of why has no one noticed and why everyone continues to treat them like crap even though there is no reason they shouldn't be aware of their power. These lead to situations where if the power fantasy gets too crazy, at best people who aren't into the fantasy lose interest, and at worst even the people who are will find it tedious. But these problems aren't problems if you're smart about how you write it. One Punch Man is proof you can tell a compelling story with a character who is overpowered with all the bathos that would come from Goku stepping into Jujutsu Kaisen and one-tapping Sukuna. For a less comedy-based example, Gojo Satoru, to an extent, is a serious take on the effect being the strongest has on you that gets even more interesting when you see how his enemies plan around him. As for the hidden power aspect, Naruto, even if it isn't purely a power fantasy, is my go-to example. Naruto has a lot of talent and the demon fox that basically acts as a giant chakra battery, but social effects of that power makes him disliked, as well as the negative consequences that come with it. And even then, the story doesn't go so far that it becomes unbelievable in how people underestimate and don't like him once he starts applying himself. And ultimately, it switches out of being so much of a power fantasy in that way to tell a more ideological tale. And now, after all that preamble, Solo Leveling. The first season finished recently, and while I have read the manhwa, this video will be sticking entirely to the anime to try and look at how this much beloved story marries its power fantasy with its story, where it succeeds and where it fails. The first aspect of the power fantasy to look at, and one I think the anime has handled well so far, is the world around Sung Jin Woo. You see, power fantasy characters exist to be the strongest, so the world and other characters are extensions of that existence. If you exist, you will in some way be relevant to displaying the main character's awesomeness. Be it as an enemy, a spectator, a hype tool, it all goes back to them. And so far, Solo Leveling has done an excellent job giving its characters reasons to exist beyond that. Take Lee Joo-hee. From a utilitarian writing standpoint, she exists for various reasons. One is that she displays that there's something desirable about Sung before he becomes OP. Another is as someone he knows he can trust and he can save as part of his growth. But the fact she's a short-lived character gives her more reason to exist because she's characterized as someone who can't handle a life of violence and displays the strain of fighting monsters from a new perspective as someone who decides to retire due to trauma. Does this reflect Sung's character? Yes. But it's written in a way that her character doesn't come off as existing just to elevate the main character, but actually tells us quite a bit about the world. An even better example is Yoo Jin-ho. He is basically a hype man who exists for various purposes, but all those purposes coalesce around his character, creating someone who's trying to gain the approval of his family by helping them retain their existence as a big conglomerate in a world more and more reliant on hunters for resources. The exposition dump is absolutely ridiculous, but regardless, he provides a good window into the world building. On top of that, the season dedicates ample time to build up the characters who everyone can probably tell will become further hype tools in regards to Sung's ever-growing character, making them look less like future people who are going to stare in absolute bewilderment as this E-class hero kills God in front of them, and more like people who exist in the world and have their own motivations. As long as it doesn't drop the ball in the future and make the audience think of the characters as purely hype tools the narrative doesn't care about beyond their ability to be shocked at how powerful Sung is, it can actually build an interesting sidecast around this guy. Another thing the story does well is Sung's character. This is arguably the most recognizable issue when it comes to creating power fantasies: the everyman problem, where the character is meant to be considered relatable in order for the audience to self-insert into them. The more you can make the main character like the target audience, the better. It's why the criticism of isekai protagonists looking the same is kinda meaningless as anything other than an art style critique. They are meant to represent the average teen boy in the very homogeneous country of Japan. Of course they're gonna look like that. But you can't truly make a character everyone can insert themselves into on every level without boiling them down to a common denominator basic personality that will probably overshadow whatever unique characterization they do get. But the commonality of this critique means that people have been coming up with ways to get around it. Solo Leveling does this by approaching Sung's character from the top down. With his need to be the breadwinner, provide for his family, and the frustration with his weakness, his reliable and perfectly understandable motivations allow the audience to live vicariously through him. Sung is less of a self-insert where you're meant to see yourself in his character, and more of a situation insert where you're meant to see yourself reacting to the character's situation. This is kind of a common thing you see in the rising from the bottom types who at least take some time to become ridiculously powerful. You may not have Sung's character traits, but you should be able to imagine overcoming his experiences. And if all else fails, you can simply root for him as someone you want to see succeed after all he's been through. But not everything can be positive, which brings us to the biggest point where the story shows its hand. It's the story's ability to have tension when Sung Jin Woo is fighting. And I think it's actually pretty good until it isn't. Most stories will end with the protagonist winning, so if you're going to throw them in life or death situations, despite all the danger you display, there is an expectation they will survive. Unless your name is Gege and people in your fanbase start unironically wondering if the villain's just going to win. A lot of Sung Jin Woo's fights are just exercises in his awesomeness, and they are very hyped to watch because oftentimes they are a result of his work to grow stronger, and we definitely want to see him impress or humiliate the characters around him. You may have noticed that when Sung Jin Woo is out in the real world where there are witnesses, that's when it's time for him to start dominating. But we do still get to see him have to work to grow stronger. So let's look at that working to grow stronger. It takes skill to balance putting your protagonist in such danger, but also consistently pulling them out. And I think Solo Leveling is more neutral in its ability to do this. The best example is the fight with Cerberus, where Jinwoo is almost lethally outmatched. In fact, by all rights, if he was a normal character, he should have lost. But the system that makes him the main character provides him with all sorts of advantages, like the ability to ignore poisonous debuffs that allows him to drink snake venom to get stronger. And then, as he lies in a pool of his and the dog's blood, he realizes that that was just the guard dog sitting in front of the actual building, and he's definitely not ready to keep going. And this makes further sense because the system canonically wants him to survive. The system put him in this danger. It's not crazy that abusing it like a video game hack allows him to survive. The point of the story is that he's the only person in the world who can grow stronger after all. But when the story deigns to put Sung Jin Woo in trouble, its methods of getting him out aren't always satisfying. Take the fight with Igris the Blood Red, who was absolutely destroying this guy in every way before the eyes of man, God, and everybody, before the armor Sung picked up 10 minutes ago allowed him to catch the guy's sword, and with what I can only describe as a shonen hype power-up that even people who love the fight call bullshit on, he forces out a win. And it's so hype like you have no idea. And an even less satisfying example is what happens immediately after when Sung has to survive as long as possible with enemies spawning in en masse to attack. The longer he survives, the more points he gets, and it really puts him on the back foot. But then it turns out he somehow forgot to do his daily exercise requirement and he gets teleported to another dimension for 4 hours. And what was a punishment room in the very beginning of the story has now just become a place where he can do some training, allowing him to level up, heal, recuperate, buy appropriate weapons, and even get a new power that lets him use telekinesis with no cost to his mana. All of this would make perfect sense if I actually believed Sung would forget to do his training and wasn't perfectly aware of the fact that all of that was just set up so he could survive this situation. And yet, it all works out to his advantage, and what was a dire situation with an honestly interesting character moment becomes an opportunity for Sung to dominate once again. The fight wasn't even bad, but how he locked out of what was a beating and turned it into a massacre on his part was transparent. And because of how much time he spent in the other dimension, and the fact he won, he gets all sorts of extra bonuses and becomes even stronger than he already was. And this is the thing that ultimately leads him to become a necromancer, which, well, wait for season 2. I have honestly been enjoying solo leveling a lot. It's a power fantasy that, for the most part, has managed to keep itself afloat in the story department. And with all the criticism the power fantasy genre has gotten, I think it's worth analyzing what's become so popular in an absolute sea of them. But you tell me, what do you think of solo leveling and this video? Tell me in the comments below, and while you're down there, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more content. Thank you, and good day.